Hi everybody, welcome back. In this video we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Instead of normal lectures and lecture notes, we're going to be looking at some applications of GDP. In the last series of videos I covered GDP, definitions, what's included, the components, and some other details about GDP, so go check those out if you haven't already. In this video, we're just going to start working our way through these GDP applications and just sharing some data to give you an idea and a little flavor of what the GDP statistics look like in the United States. So this first table here, we have all the components of, not all the components, we have the components of GDP. Remember, these are C plus I plus G plus NX, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, along with a little bit of sub-level detail on each of those. In fact, it gets into even smaller detail if you were to continue and going out into the actual data set, which in this case comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So we have some time series here going back to 1950, and I would encourage you to maybe just pause, take a look at the table, look at any observations you have, and then I'm just going to go through here and talk about some of these main points coming off of this graph. So first, which component contributed most to GDP in 1950? That would have been consumption. I'll write it right here, consumption. We can see that here, 192 billion compared to 57, 51, and 1 billion. What about in 1980? Again, you can check that out. It's also consumption, and so it was in 2015, consumption. So a quick takeaway from that part is that consumption spending makes up the majority of American GDP. Consumption spending makes up the majority of U.S. GDP. Okay, how about this next one? From 1950 to 1970, net exports were positive. After 1980, they became negative. We see that here, the difference in the positive numbers here versus the negative numbers here on net exports. As mentioned in the last video, all that's saying is that since then, we have spent more on imports than exports, and that's what we call a trade deficit. So remember, net exports is equal to exports minus imports. So after the 70s, the US started importing more than it exported. The US started importing more than it exported. So essentially a trade deficit. Okay, so that's what we see there. And moving right along, looking at some information on government spending. In 2015, did the federal or state and local governments spend more money? If you go up and look at that, that is state and local, and you can calculate that out. You'll see that it's 62% of all government spending in the United States back in 2015. Here at GDP, what percent of GDP and federal government spending was spent on national defense in 2015? I'll show you where we're looking here. That's basically this number is national defense spending, This is federal government spending and total GDP. So that's where we're getting these numbers. But as a percentage of total GDP, we can just take defense spending divided by GDP. That's 732 billion over 18 trillion. And that'll come out to 4.06%. So military spending, somewhat small share of total GDP, but if you look at the share of the federal government spending, we'll see this share is going to increase quite substantially. So $732 billion on national defense out of 1.2 trillion. That comes out to 59.76%. So out of the whole entire federal government, military spending makes up a very substantial portion of that. Okay, that's it from the first table. Next one is a quick graph just to show the composition of goods versus services in the United States. In 1950, the share of goods was about 61%, and services 39%. And what you can see in this graph here is that the proportion of services has increased dramatically over time, and the numbers associated with that are goods moving down from 61 to 46, down even to 33%, which is just a third of output. And so we have 54% and 67%. So we've moved from a point where services made up approximately a third, and now they make up 2/3. So they've kind of switched places in the last half a century or so, 75 years. And the lesson here is that service industries continue to make up a larger portion of consumption and GDP over time. Service industries continue to make up a larger share of consumption and GDP over time. Okay, that's it for that graph. Just continuing to move along to show some more statistics here. Here we have national income by industry, and so now looking at the highest and lowest value industries in the United States. This first one, finance, insurance, and real estate, is sometimes called FIRE, finance, insurance, and real estate. Professional and business services, and then manufacturing, which we'll talk in a little bit of extra detail about manufacturing in just a moment. Which industries contribute to most GDP? Are these primarily goods or services? And then we'll also look at the lowest few industries, which sometimes comes as a surprise. Mining, utilities, and agriculture, for as much as mining and particularly agriculture are talked about in the political sphere, it really makes up a relatively small portion of total GDP in the United States. So just going to kind of summarize that here. Top three industries are FIRE, which is going to be, well, let me write the second one first. Professional and business services, as we see, and manufacturing, which I'll abbreviate. These first two are largely service-based services. Manufacturing is a bit more goods-based, but there are plenty, numerous service-based goods and services associated with manufacturing as well. Take an engineer as an example. Any type of engineering would be considered a service-based industry. And then which contribute the least, here we have mining, utilities, and agriculture. Okay, and so one note I have on this is that I'll just point out, I won't write it down, but if we take some Bureau of Labor statistics from 2019, a commonly talked about industry in politics is sometimes coal mining in the United States. And just wanted to give you a flavor for the size of the coal mining industry. The total industry has about 50,000 jobs in the entire country. 50,000 total jobs. And then just to give a little context to that, take this healthcare and health services. Coal mining having 50,000 total jobs. In the month of August in 2019, so in 1 month, healthcare added 36,000 jobs into that industry in 1 month alone. So basically, in two months, the healthcare sector is adding more jobs than the entire coal mining industry in aggregate. So again, mining and agriculture as well. Agriculture with about 70,000 jobs in 2019. Also, with a couple months, the number of jobs being added in healthcare and finance and things like that are far outpacing the total amounts of jobs in some of these much smaller industries. Okay, so I do want to talk a little bit in particular about manufacturing. And to do that, we're going to be looking at 3 graphs. So this first one is jobs, manufacturing employment. The observation I have here, again, keep in mind these gray bars are the recessions, and as we would expect, we see declines during recessions. During the 2010s decade, there's this kind of long expansion, which ended with coronavirus. But the point is, since kind of the late 80s or early 90s, employment has fallen to near historical lows. And here we have about 25 to 30% drop from 1990 to 2019, to give a little flavor. So more than a quarter, almost a third of jobs disappeared in that time frame. If we include coronavirus, the jobs lost during that pandemic, it would probably move up to even maybe a third potentially. So basically, employment at all-time lows, and politicians really on both sides of the aisle like to talk about this when they're kind of looking for votes. But this next graph will show you that manufacturing is not dead. In fact, we are at near all-time highs in terms of the value of manufacturing output over time. And so, observation here, manufacturing output is at near all-time highs. At near all-time highs. And so here we can see that, yes, the jobs are going away, but they're not all going abroad, they're not all being outsourced. Some of them are, but the bigger picture here is that Yes, some of the jobs are going away, but we're more productive than ever, and that is because of our third graph, which is productivity. And ultimately, it's going to be coming down to ideas like increases in automation and technology. So here, manufacturing productivity is also at near all-time highs. Manufacturing productivity is at near all-time highs. And the question then is, so what's happening? Where have all the jobs gone? Essentially, a couple points here, but manufacturing continues to be successful in output due to increased productivity through innovation, automation, and technology. So, manufacturing, abbreviation, continues to be successful in output due to increased productivity through, I'll just say, automation and technology. Okay, there we have it, and one more graph to show you for this video, and that'll do it for us, is looking at real GDP per capita. Again, real corrects for inflation, so all of these numbers are directly comparable across time. And the point here, and this question here, real GDP was approximately 25,000 here in the early 1970s. And in 2019, it was 57,000. So what does this tell us about the standard of living in the United States? It has more than doubled in the last 50 years. If you take it back 75 years to the early 50s, it's almost more than quadrupled. And so what we're really seeing here is this increased real GDP per capita. Like we talked about in the last video, that's a really good proxy for economic growth, it is economic growth. It's a good proxy for increases in the standard of living, because as our incomes increase as a population, we have access to better healthcare, education, leisure, environmental quality, so on and so forth. So standard of living really increasing dramatically over time, and this is really this process that we're seeing of economic growth, which is our next topic, and we're going to have a series of lectures on economic growth in the next few videos. So do stay tuned for those, and I will see you there. Thanks.